Hello everybody! This is probably my most exciting devlog to date, but we'll get to why in a bit. So, to begin with, you may notice the wall textures look very different to the last update. I had a go at making my own to reduce the amount of borrowed artwork that I wasn't even sure I had permission to use. At first I was convinced these were objectively worse, but figured, it's worth it, cause at least I own these textures, but you know what? They kind of fit with the character and weapon design really well, and I'm starting to warm up to them. Anyway, last video, I mentioned that I needed to add some more code to the weapon system to allow for shotguns. The first step was to add random weapon spread, controlled by an export variable, which I also enabled on other guns. So the SMG, for example, no longer has pinpoint accuracy. Unless firing from across the map, this isn't likely to cause you to miss any more shots, but it does look better to have blood and spark particles spread out more. Speaking of particles, I improved them a bit too. Up until now, there was only ever one blood and one spark particle emitter that were moved around and reset when needed. But this doesn't work for shotguns, which need to show multiple hits at once. And it did look a bit strange for the SMG with its high fire rate to see the blood particle reset over and over again. So, I made a pool of multiple particle emitters that loops through them so you can have more in play at once. Now, the most important step for a shotgun is to have multiple shots come out, so I replaced the code that checked the raycast for a hit and replaced it with a loop that finds all raycasts attached to the weapon. In order to improve performance, I also disabled all raycasts on guns, only having them activate, force an update and turn back off for every shot, as otherwise the raycasts will be making their checks on every frame. And that might be a problem if there are multiple shotgun wielders making 8 raycast calls or more every frame each. Anyway, I drew this shotgun model, combined the shotgun blast and cock sound effect to make this. And we have a shotgun in the game. At some point I also added a pain state so enemies freeze for a short amount of time every time they get shot. Currently there are no animation frames for it. I feel like the blood particles get the message across just fine, but that's not to say I won't add those in later. And now the really exciting part. I finally heard back from Valve and got my Steam developer account, so I set up the game on Steam's partner website so I could get an app ID and download the Steamworks API. In order to use it with Godot, I had to use the Steam Godot module. Installing new modules into Godot is not very straightforward, so this took a day. I had to download the source code for Godot and the Godot Steam module, ensure my installation of Visual Studio included the C++ bits, download Python and scons, and then compile Godot 3 times, once for the editor and twice for export packages. Once that was done, I added in a couple of lines to my start screen to see if Steamworks would initialize, and who knew a console log could be so damn beautiful? Now the real work began. The main reason I applied for the Steam developer account in the first place was to get access to Steam Lobbies, so I had to redo all the netcode to work over Steamworks. I didn't want to remove direct IP connections, so people could still play over LAN or host their own games if they knew how to forward ports, mainly because I still want to keep the game on itch.io. So, I copied the network manager script and replaced all the Archon calls with sending a P2P packet over the Steam lobby. This actually took a lot of trial and error as the documentation is a bit vague, but I got it working in the end. I added a new button to the start screen to create a private Steam game and added the code necessary so the game can handle joining a lobby through Steam, even allowing you to accept an invite or join a game before opening the game. And then I generated a few Steam keys and handed them out to friends, and we tested it out. That first time I sent my friend an invite through the Steam overlay and they just accepted it and popped into my game. I'm not gonna lie, I nearly cried. And then they hosted a game and I joined them and all my concerns about how I'm going to handle the multiplayer just faded away. This works! Also, can we all just take a minute to appreciate how wild it is that nowadays you can just do that? Apart from the submission fee and eventually Valve's cut out of my sales, I'm not paying Valve to handle my multiplayer, no server costs or anything, that's just... By the way, if it's not obvious by now would be a good time for me to point out, Return to Sender is on Steam and you can wishlist it right now. So, please wishlist Return to Sender on Steam? That would help me tremendously. Anyway, once I got over how cool it was that the multiplayer was working and I had Steam integration, that's a lie, I am not going to get over how cool that is for a very long time. I made an achievement just to see how it's done, and made it so Steam keeps track of the number of matches and wins you have. You can't see this information yet, but it'll be useful for more achievements later. With that done, I had this idea that I was convinced wasn't going to work, but I was determined to try it anyway. I wanted to see if it was possible to take a screenshot every so often and send it over to the other player for a picture-in-picture, semi-live feed of your opponent. But as I expected, taking the screenshot in-engine freezes the game for a split second, so doing this would have meant constant micro-stutter, which is not acceptable. I didn't think this would work and didn't spend too much time on it, so I'm not all that disappointed, but a friend of mine did have a really cool idea. When you die, a screenshot is taken and sent to the other player so they get a good look at the last thing you saw before you died. Now, it's not in the game yet, but I am probably going to put that in at some point because I love the sound of that, and I think a split-second freeze on death is acceptable. I did have a backup plan for when the screenshot idea failed, and that was to use a radar instead. So, I found a tutorial on how to create a minimap for a top-down game. I had to fiddle with it a bit to convert 3D positions into 2D relative positions, but in the end I got a radar that showed the player's orientation, enemies, and shops. I won't go into too much detail because I don't want to just repeat what's in the tutorial, but I highly recommend it if you are doing anything like that and want something in your game. I added a boolean to the radar to determine whether it was for the local player or the remote player. That's the enemy player. The radar only updates itself if it's for the local player. I then added the functionality to send and receive all of the markers over the network, so each player sends their local radar markers to the other, and received markers are displayed on the remote radar. So now it's possible for a player to get a glimpse of how the other player is doing, other than just seeing their health. This feels like a big deal to me as it makes the multiplayer feel a bit more concrete. And that's pretty much it for the last couple of weeks. You wouldn't believe how excited I am to have the game on Steam. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's nothing special, anyone can do it. We've all seen the crap that gets put on Steam, but nevertheless it makes this feel so much more official, so much more real. And having the multiplayer work is a huge weight lifted off my shoulders. I honestly had no idea how I was going to manage matchmaking and the port forward problem. So if it wasn't for a very helpful Steam users suggesting Steam Godot, I've got no idea what I would have done. I've still got to add public lobbies and matchmaking, but that's not going to be very difficult considering how much of that is already handled by Steamworks. I've bought a royalty-free music bundle that has a few tracks I really like with track names such as BFG 9000, Ghosts of Phobos, etc. So it's clearly inspired by Doom. I'll probably put together a background music system in either before or after the public lobbies. As usual, please like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already, and be sure to wishlist Return to Sender on Steam. I'm so excited I can say that now. I'll see you in the next video.